should be ordered, and it should be one of submission on the part of the wife. So in what areas? In everything. It's kind of, again, it's something that can easily be abused if the husband comes in demanding this type of thing and comes in with, and you're going to give me what's mine, and you owe me submission, and you need to do this. Well, that's one way of leading, but that's not, again, as we get into this next section, that's not how Christ led, and that's not how we as husbands should lead either. Any other comments or questions here on this section? All right. So, husbands. So, we have this section here now where all of a sudden now husbands are in the hot seat, and I think more so than the wife because of what's requested, or what's not requested, what's required of us. So love your wives. Okay, well that's easy enough. We can say, okay, well I'm commanded to love my wife. Well, there's a lot to be said about that, even within our culture today. That's a command. We live in a society that views love as a feeling, as something that you fall in and out of, as something that is romanticized, and certainly there is romantic love that occurs within the marriage, but that's not the love that's being talked about here. The love that's being talked about here is agape love. Self-serving, self-sacrificing love. So we are sacrificing for the needs of the others. So something that's interesting is, as we look at this, so submission is, what would you say submission is in its basic form? It's putting someone else before yourself. What's love? What's agape love? It's basically the same thing. Right, and in a lot of ways, love, this agape love, is really, it's pretty similar. We are putting the needs of the other person above our own needs. So when you have this relationship, it works when you have both people working for the betterment of the other. So husbands are to love their wives. This is a command. This is something that you can't just say, well, I'm no longer in love with you, I'm going to leave, as many in our society do. This is a commitment. This is a covenant. This is something that if you look at your marriage vows, this is something that you promise to do. And so just to turn your back on that is breaking an oath in and of itself. So you're commanded to love your wife. You're commanded to, that's something that you're going to put her needs before your own. You're going to love her in that way. And that's further demonstrated and clarified when you look at how it's described here, as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. So all of a sudden now, the husband's responsibility looks a lot more difficult because now we are to not only to love our wives, but to love them as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. This is a self-sacrificing love. This is where we are putting someone else before ourselves, and all that we're doing is trying to improve and to help the other person. I say improve, where we're going here in just a moment. But this is something that's bigger than just the way that we think of love. So again, that goes back to what Andrew was saying just a moment ago. This is a love that serves. This is a love that leads by service. So you think about how Christ loved his disciples. You think about the things that he did for his disciples and the people of this world while he walked this earth. What did that look like? It looked like washing feet. It looked like going out of his way to put others' needs before his own. And you think about the washing of feet specifically. Whose feet did he wash? All the disciples, which included who? Judas. So does the wife have to act a certain way or have to behave a certain way, have to do something special in order for her to earn that love? No. This is something that's commanded of husbands, whether or not we feel like our needs are being met. I mean, so again, this is something that both people are working in the same direction, that is serving and working towards the needs of the other. That's what this looks like. It's a mutual giving and a mutual working for the betterment of the other person, for working for their best interests. And so, when we think about serving and think about leading, that's, we don't, it's kind of the way that Jesus would describe it. He would say, when you look at masters and within that society, you see someone as a master, someone who's being served. And sometimes that's the way that we view the husband and wife relationship. And this idea of submission is, well, I'm going to kick back and my wife's going to serve me. She's going to do this for me. She's going to do all these things physically, and then, and she's going to get my tea, refill my tea glass. She's going to do all these things, and she may, but that's not the picture of what you're supposed to be, because that's the kind of thing that you're supposed to be doing as a husband. You're supposed to be serving her. You're supposed to be loving her in that way. So this is a way that husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water of the word. So this sanctifying and cleansing is something that you look at the relationship again to Christ in the church. This is something that I think is really interesting, because when Christ cleansed us, that's an event that happened at a point in time. But does that cleansing or sanctifying, does that stop, or is that a continual thing that happens? It's a continual thing. Why is that? Because we continue to sin. We're not what we ought to be, even though God has made us. And so again, we've talked about that in this class. In reality, in God's eyes, we are something, but we're striving for that when we think about how we ought to act. It's an already but not yet thing. We are already cleansed, we're already purified in God's eyes, but God is continually cleansing us because we're not acting up to what we actually are in reality. And so there's a continual process where we have to continually be cleansed and washed, and that's something that continues throughout our relationship with God. So it's really interesting when you look at the husband and wife relationship, which one of us is perfect going into that relationship? Neither. So we're both in need of a continual cleansing and washing, and we're both continually striving to be something that we are not. I heard one person talk about it in this way, that when you get married to someone, a lot of times we look for that perfect person to marry. And the problem is that perfect person doesn't exist. We are all imperfect, and what we ought to be looking for is looking for that person who is working to be that perfect person, who's working to be that person who looks more and more like Jesus. And so as we live our lives, we're working together, and the husband is helping the wife, and the wife is helping the husband to continually cleanse each other, continually purify each other, so that ultimately we're working towards what will look like in that final day when Jesus is taken away, ultimately all of our imperfections in eternity. So we're working towards this being this perfect person. We're not that perfect person, and so sometimes we get married and we think, well, I married this person and they're not the same person they used to be. Well, that's probably true of us too. We're not the same people that we were when we got married. We're hopefully much different. Hopefully we're working towards being more and more like Christ every day. And so we become different people, and we become cleansed, we become sanctified the more that we work together in this relationship. Christ and Jesus continually cleansing us and washing us. In the same way we are doing that for each other, we're working towards just sanctifying one another. And so this is a relationship where we're helping each other to be what we ought to be. And so, you as a spouse, you see imperfections in your husband. As a wife, you see your imperfections in your husband that he may not see, and the husband may see imperfections in the wife that she may not see. The trick is, how do you work together and help each other to be better in such a way that's not harsh, that's not. So again, you have this picture of a body and washing and cleansing a body. How do you do that with your own body, right? I mean, if you have an eyebrow that's out of place, or something, you just be real rough, or and you get rid of the imperfections. And sometimes it's like with our kids, they got a dirty spot on them, and we'll take a washcloth and just scrub it, and we're not as gentle with them as we would be if we were scrubbing a dirty spot off of our own face. So this is something that we have to learn to work together, and to be kind, and to serve one another, and to help each other to grow, and help each other to be what they ought to be as we go throughout this marriage relationship. So this is something where we're continually working for the betterment of the other person, which ultimately means that we're working to help them to be more and more like Christ. So we're serving and leading in that way. So husbands are leading in a very sacrificial way, leading in a way that helps to purify and to cleanse and to build up the wife. That he might present the church to himself with splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that he might be holy, that she might be holy and without, in that screen, without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So we have these pictures here of this washing of water with the word. I would say that would be a reference then back to baptism there. That's where that initially happens. But then there's a continual cleansing that we see. 1 John chapter 1 highlights that as we walk in the light, as he's in the light, the blood of Christ continually cleanses us. And so God, and through Christ, is continually purifying the church, continually cleansing the church, and ultimately to the end that he's going to present this church to himself. He's going to present it in a way that's splendor, described as in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, and that she might be holy and without blemish. So we're working towards that. That's something that we're working towards individually. That's something that we're working towards collectively as the church, and that ultimately it will be fulfilled in eternity. And I think none of us are going to get there and be there perfectly in this lifetime, but that's something that we're striving for. So again, this picture of loving their wives as their own bodies. Husbands are to, if you're going to treat her as you would treat yourself, because, as he's going to highlight in just a moment, you are one flesh. Other thoughts or comments or anything on this section? Brother Franklin.
Hear what he says. Gave himself. We need to think about that all of us are sinners, and that we deserve death. And Jesus came forward and said, God, take me, I'll die for you. And that's what, if a husband loves his wife in that way, there will never be any fault in him.
Right. Yeah, you think about the sacrificial love of Christ ultimately giving his physical life on the cross. Sometimes it almost seems like that's easier than living sacrificially. It would almost be easier to give our physical lives than our day-to-day lives. At least that's the way we treat it. We would maybe jump in front of a car for our spouse, but then when it comes to the day-to-day things, we have more trouble acting sacrificially in that way at times. I'm just judging by our actions, but maybe it's because we don't have very many opportunities to jump in front of a car. I don't know, but it seems that if you look at the way that we love sacrificially, ultimately, does it look like Christ? Does it look like is it apparent that you would give your life for her? Is it apparent that is that apparent by the way that you live sacrificially every day? Again, I think that's sometimes the harder piece to this is living sacrificially every day, because sometimes we start to get our own needs and our own desires and our own wants, and we put those in front of the needs and desires of our spouse. So what happens if your needs aren't being met as a spouse? What do we typically, what's our inclination? What's our first response? We draw back. And so we stop fulfilling the needs of their needs. They're not fulfilling my needs. I'm not going to fulfill their needs. I know that they want this, and so I'm not going to do that because they didn't do this. And it becomes a transactional relationship. So you think about what happens when you You've got a grocery store that you go to, and you go and you buy your groceries at this grocery store, and the people there are friendly, and they got good prices, and it's kind of close to home. But all of a sudden, a new grocery store comes up, and it's a little bit closer to home. They got a little bit better prices. Where do you go? You go to the new grocery store because they can meet your needs in a little bit better way. Sometimes that's the way we treat our relationships with our spouses as well. It's a very transactional thing. You're not meeting my needs, I'll just go somewhere else and get my needs met there. But that's not the way that this relationship is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a covenant relationship where the purpose of the covenant is not to fulfill your own needs, but to fulfill the needs of the other. So it's not a transactional relationship where you say, well, I'm not getting what I want out of this, and so I'm going somewhere else. And that's how our society views marriage. That's how, if we're not careful, we can fall into that same trap. And all of a sudden we start treating our marriages very, very transactionally, and we say, well, this is what I want out of this, and if I'm not getting it, well, then I'm not gonna give you what you're wanting. But if both people are serving, and again, this is something that works best when both people are serving the other, but ultimately, and I think the ultimate fulfillment of this is that you, as an individual, whether you're husband or wife, you have an ultimate spouse in Christ Jesus. So if your marriage is the ultimate thing, if your marriage is the ultimate place where you find satisfaction and that's the thing that has to be right for everything else to be right, and you make that the ultimate thing, then what's going to happen is you're inevitably going to fall back into that transactional type of relationship. And if the marriage is not right, or something, your needs aren't being met in the way that they ought to be, then you start pulling back because you're not having your needs met. But if you view Christ as the ultimate spouse, well, has Christ met all the needs that you have? Well, yes. Does he love you in the way that he ought to love you? Yes. Well, is it easier to submit to Christ because of that? Yes. And if Christ is the ultimate thing and you find fulfillment in that, then you don't have to start finding fulfillment in other things. And that's ultimately what God considers sin, is when we start to, a lot of it is when we start to try to find fulfillment other places when God has provided that fulfillment through himself. So we start looking for security, we start looking for fame, or for our self-worth in other places other than God. And so if we trust in God and we view him as the ultimate spouse, then we don't have to, everything doesn't have to be perfect on the other person's side for us to continue to fulfill our obligations we ought to. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's probably not as good at describing that as others, but it's there's an ultimate relationship here that's being pointed to that's bigger than just our marriages. Our marriages point to the ultimate. Our marriages are a way for us to understand the ultimate. And I think this is the ideal, and we're just trying to live up to the ideal. We're trying to live up to what Christ has already done for us. Questions or comments or anything on this section? This last section here then, for no one ever hated his own flesh. Again, so you're loving your wife as you love yourself because you are one flesh. And no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, and he's going back to Genesis chapter 2, therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I'm saying that refers to Christ and the church. So ultimately, it's referring to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So again, we're looking at how do we treat our wife here? How is it that we are responding to her? Well, we're nourishing and cherishing her the same way that we would nourish, feed, and cherish our own body. We're treating her as she is in reality, part of us because we are one flesh together. So just as Christ does for the church, because we are members of his body. We are members of Christ's body, and because of that, he is nourishing us, he is cherishing us, he values us. And so that this picture, again, is looking at something bigger than us. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So all of this is rooted in Genesis 2. All this goes back to Genesis 2. And I would argue that the reason that part of the reason that we have this relationship is so that we can start to understand God and start to understand his love for us and start to understand exactly, how God feels about us. And all of that is rooted in this marriage relationship that we can start to see and start to experience how God feels about us. And then we strive to model our marriages after that ultimate one. So again, this mystery is profound, but it refers to Christ and to the church. This is something. This is something that as we strive for it, we need to think about it within the confines of the church as well, and think about how we have been redeemed, how we've been purchased as a body of his people. And then I think really interesting here at the end, however, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respect her husband. These things, if you really look at it in most, if not all relationships, the wife's primary need is to feel loved. And if you really look at it, if you look at the source of your fights, you look at the source of your discontentment with your relationship, it falls back to these two things. It's either the husband feeling like he's not being respected, or the wife feeling like she's not loved. And I think that's really interesting. As you dwell on that and you think back, it's at least in my marriage, it seems to be true. It's when we have problems is when I'm not making Denise feel loved, and when we have problems is when I feel disrespected. And so those are two of the primary needs of the husband and wife. And I think sometimes if we would focus and recognize how we're coming across in different situations, that would help us as we're striving to kind of build our relationships together. These are things that a wife needs to feel like she's loved, and again, that ultimate love is not going to, it doesn't reflect what the world would call love. And so when we're not putting her needs first, when we're not serving the way that Christ served, then she starts to feel that way. When the wife is not submitting, then when the wife is being, not being respectful, not submitting, not showing that attitude, then the husband starts to feel like things are not right. And so again, both of these things work together, and I think that's where we started out, submitting for one another out of reverence for Christ. All of this goes back to our respect, our love, our fear of the Lord, the way that we would respect Christ. All of that, that's the basis for all of this. The basis is not because it makes sense to our society. It's not because this is the way that our society thinks is right. It's not because we agree with it personally. I think Eddie Gilpin during VBS made a comment. If your God doesn't disagree with you, then your God is probably you. So this may be one of those areas that you view, and you see this passage, and maybe you view this idea of submission as a woman, and you don't like it. It's not necessarily our job to like it or to agree with it. All of this is based out of our submission to Christ and our being willing to put ourselves under him because we realize who he is and what he's done for us. He created us. You think he knows what we need in this life? Again, the same thing then for the husband. If we're self-seeking and we're looking to fulfill our own needs, and we're not showing that love for our spouse, and maybe that's not what we feel like should be happening. We want to be happy in our relationship. We want to view love as the world views love. When we do that, then we start to kind of highlight this world more so than we do the relationship with Christ and the church. and we're not putting ourselves in submission to Christ in that way. It's not up to us to agree with it. It's not up to us to necessarily understand it at all times, but I think this is one that within the husband-wife relationship, it's one that's very easily understood, that these things are true just from experience. Any comments or questions or anything on this section? Brother Skip.
I'll not forget everything to this section shows towards relationship charity. Both are relationship between brothers is Joseph brother.
Okay.
So it's that's kind of a relationship that we can look at and say that's purest kind of love that we would ever really ask.
I think that's a good point. That nourishing and cherishing, you said if you didn't hear it, it refers to a mother-infant relationship, and so that being a very pure form of love. And I think the reason that we view that as what is it that the child is contributing to that relationship? They contribute crying in the middle of the night. They contribute, eating and getting their diaper changed when they want it changed, and it's just they're not contributing much to the relationship, or they're not giving. But what happens is you're giving yourself to that child. You're loving that child selflessly, and what does that create? Well, that self-giving love creates the feeling. The actions create the feeling, and solidify that feeling and that feeling of love that you have for the child. And we understand that within a parent-child relationship, but sometimes, again, within the husband-wife relationship, we expect it to be this magical thing that if we're not feeling something, then we stop the actions. Well, it's the actions, then the self-giving love that drives the feeling. That's what it is. That's the direction that it works, and sometimes we want it to work the opposite way. We want the feeling, and the feeling's going to drive the action. So that's not how it works. And so anytime we have, if you're having marriage relationships, you have people that are acting selfishly. One or both are acting selfishly, and not putting the other's needs first. Anything else here on this section? Yeah, I mean, again, if we are, 1 Peter 3, that section on wives and husbands, and if we're not doing these things, verse number 7 there, your prayers will be hindered. So all of this, I think all this contributes together and kind of goes back to the fact that these relationships are something that are reflective of where we are spiritually in a lot of ways. If we're not acting like Christ in this relationship, we're not likely acting like Christ in any of our relationships. But this is one where it often shows up, and we can kind of see our own selfishness and our own selfish tendencies to want to fulfill our own desires. All right. Anything else before we close? Well, thank you so much for your attention. We'll pick up Ephesians chapter 6 next week, Lord willing.